Mr. Richards was quite good at shooting with a rifle, and he had taken part in several competitions in his small town. He had never actually won a prize, but each time he had done well, and once he had come fourth. Then he had to go to a big city on business for a month, and as he had nothing much to do in the evenings there, he joined the local rifle club and spent several pleasant evenings shooting there. The rifle club had a very good first team, which used to take part in a lot of important shooting competitions. One of these took place while Mr. Richards was with them, and of course he went to see it. But one of the members of the club's team suddenly fell ill just before the match, and the captain had to choose somebody else to take his place in a hurry. He had heard that Mr. Richards had taken part in several competitions already, and he had seen for himself at the club that, although he was not really up to the standard of the club's first team, he was quite a good shot. He therefore invited him to take the sick man's place. Mr. Richards felt greatly honoured to be asked to shoot for such a good team, but he also felt very nervous because he was afraid of making a fool of himself and letting down his team. In fact, he was so nervous that he couldn't keep his hands from trembling while he was shooting, with the result that he did very badly in the competition. When he took his scorecard to his captain, he said, "After seeing my score, I feel like going outside and shooting myself." The captain looked at the card for a few seconds and then said, "Well, you had better take 2 bullets with you if you do that."
The government wanted to put up a big office building in the capital and had to choose an engineering company to do the work. Several big companies wanted the job because it would bring them a lot of money if they could get it. But of course, they couldn't all have it, so the government had to decide which of them should be the lucky one. They therefore appointed a government official to examine the various companies' offers, decide which were the most suitable, and then advise the Minister of Works which of them to choose. After some months, the choice was made, and work was about to begin when one of the companies which hadn't been successful complained to the minister. They said that the official who had been responsible for advising him on the choice of a company to do the work had accepted bribes. The minister at once ordered an inquiry into the whole matter, and after a month had proof that the official had indeed taken bribes. He therefore sent for him and asked for an explanation. The official admitted that he had taken big bribes. "But," he said, "I didn't just take one from the company to which I recommended that you should give the work. I took a bribe from each company to favour it in my choice of the one to recommend." "Well then," said the minister, "how did you finally make your choice? Did you choose the one that gave you the biggest bribe?" "Certainly not, sir," answered the official, deeply hurt that the minister should accuse him of such dishonesty. "I was very careful to take exactly the same bribe from each of the companies that were trying to get the job." "Then how did you choose?" asked the minister. "As an honest government official," answered the man, "I chose the company that I thought would do the work best and most cheaply, of course."
The class teacher thought that hobbies were very important for every child. She encouraged all her pupils to have one, and sometimes arranged for their parents to come and see the work they'd done as a result. One Friday morning, the teacher told the class that those of them who had a hobby could have a holiday that afternoon to get the things they'd made as parts of their hobbies ready for their parents to see the following afternoon. So on Friday afternoon, while those of the pupils who had nothing to show did their usual lessons, the lucky ones who'd made something were allowed to go home on condition that they return before 5 o'clock to bring what they were going to show and to arrange it. When the afternoon lessons began, the teacher was surprised to see that Tommy wasn't there. He was the laziest boy in the class, and the teacher found it difficult to believe that he had a hobby. However, at 5:15, Tommy arrived with a beautiful collection of butterflies in glass cases. After his teacher had admired them and helped him to arrange them on a table in the classroom, she was surprised to see Tommy pick them up again and begin to leave. "What are you doing, Tommy?" she asked. "Those things must remain here until tomorrow afternoon. That's when the parents are coming to see them." "I know they're coming then," answered Tommy, "and I'll bring them back tomorrow. But my big brother doesn't want them to be out of our house at night, in case they're stolen." "But what has it got to do with your big brother?" asked the teacher. "Aren't the butterflies yours?" "No," answered Tommy. "They belong to him." "But Tommy, you're supposed to show your own hobby here, not somebody else's," said the teacher. "I know that," answered Tommy. "My hobby is watching my brother collecting butterflies."
Mr. Hall was a rich businessman and lived in a big house beside a beautiful river. Now this river usually froze over in winter, and one year it did this very early, so that by Christmas time it was covered with really thick ice. One could walk across it easily, and some brave people had even crossed it in motor cars with chains on their wheels. The sight of this ice gave Mr. Hall an idea. He decided to have a big Christmas party on the ice. He would have all the furniture and carpets in his living room carried out onto the ice. He would have pretty colored lights hung all around, and they would have a wonderful party. So he sent out invitations to all his important friends, and on Christmas Day they all began to arrive at his house and then go down onto the ice. They were all in very good spirits, and thought that it had been a wonderful idea of Mr. Hall's to have a party on the ice, surrounded by the beautiful scenery of that part of the country, but at the same time with all the comforts of armchairs, carpets, servants, good food, and plenty of drinks. The party went on until late at night, and as the last guests said their merry goodbyes, Mr. Hall congratulated himself on a very successful party. He had drunk rather a lot during the day, so he didn't wake up very early the next morning. In fact, it was nearly midday before he got up and looked out of the window at the scene of the previous day's party. What he saw there made him wonder whether he was still asleep and dreaming. He closed his eyes, opened them again, but there was no mistake. The ice had broken up during the night or in the early hours of the morning, and had carried all his living room furniture, carpets, and colored lights out to sea with it.
Mr. and Mrs. Davis were invited to Christmas drinks at a hotel one year. They left their car in the car park outside and went in. Mr. Davis was proud of the fact that he never got drunk. So he was careful not to drink too much, in spite of his host's attempts to press more and more on him. During the party, Mrs. Davis found that she had forgotten to bring a handkerchief, so she asked her husband to go out to the car and get her one. He did so, but on his way back to the hotel entrance, he heard a car horn blowing in the car park. Thinking someone might be in trouble, he went over to the car from which the noise was coming. He found a small black bear sitting in the driving seat and blowing the horn. When Mr. Davis got back to the party, he told several people about the black bear, but of course they didn't believe him and thought he was drunk. When he took them out to the car park to show them that his story was true, he found that the car with the bear in it had gone. There were so many jokes about Mr. Davis's black bear during the following days that he at last put an advertisement in the local paper. Will anybody who saw a black bear blowing the horn in a car outside the Central Hotel at about 7 p.m. on Christmas Day please phone... 2 days later, a Mrs. Richards phoned to say that she and her husband had left their pet bear Honeypot in their car outside the Central Hotel for a few minutes that evening, and that it was quite possible that he had been blowing the horn. Mrs. Richards didn't seem to think there was anything strange about that. "Honeypot likes blowing car horns," she said, "and we don't mind, as long as we're not actually driving the car."
A famous actor often had to travel by train. Of course, a lot of his fellow passengers used to recognize him on his journeys, and some of them tried to get into conversation with him. But he was usually feeling tired after acting until late the night before, so he didn't encourage them to talk to him. One day, he had just got into the train with all his luggage when a young man came and sat down in the seat opposite him. The young man took out a book and began to read it, while the actor tried to get some sleep in his corner of the carriage. When he opened his eyes, he found that the young man was looking at him with his mouth open, his book forgotten. The actor shut his eyes and tried to sleep again, but every time he opened them, the young man was looking at him with the same fixed look. At last he gave up the attempt to sleep, took out a newspaper, put it up in front of him, and began to read. After a few moments, the young man cleared his throat and spoke. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said, "but haven't I seen you somewhere before?" The actor didn't answer. He didn't even put his newspaper down. The young man said nothing more for several minutes, but then he tried again. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said, "but are you going to San Francisco?" The actor put his paper down this time, looked at the young man severely without saying a word, and then put the paper up in front of him again. This time there was an even longer pause before the young man spoke again. Then he said, in a last attempt to start a conversation with the great man, "I'm George P. Anderson of Wilmington, Vermont." This time the actor put his paper down and spoke. "So am I," he said. That was the end of the conversation.
While Nasruddin was walking home one evening, he met 4 of his old friends. To be polite, he invited them to come home with him to supper. He was expecting that they would equally politely refuse his invitation, but to his surprise, they quickly accepted and went home with him. Nasruddin was a poor man, and there was never much food in his house. He knew that there would be very little for supper that night, even for his wife and himself, but he didn't know how to get rid of his unwanted guests without being very rude, so he let them come with him as far as his house. But when they were a short distance from his front door, he suddenly rushed forward, opened it, went in, shut it again, and then locked it. He found his wife in the kitchen, and quickly told her what had happened. Nasruddin's guests were at first surprised at his unexpected behaviour. Then they thought that he'd perhaps gone ahead to make preparations to welcome them into his house. And then, when nothing had yet happened after several minutes, they began to get angry and to bang on the door, calling at the same time for Nasruddin. After this had gone on for some time, Nasruddin sent his wife to a window to talk to the old men. She told them that Nasruddin was not at home. "What do you mean he's not at home, woman?" shouted one of the men. "We came here a few minutes ago with Nasreddin, and we saw him go into the house." Nasreddin was now afraid that the noise the old men were making would bring all his neighbours around, and that he would be publicly shamed. So he put his head out of the window and said, "Please, gentlemen, what are you making all this noise about? This house has a back door as well as a front one. Perhaps Nasreddin came in through one and went out through the other."
One day, Nasreddin was walking quietly along the road when somebody gave him a violent blow on the back of the neck. He looked behind him and saw a young man whom he'd never seen before. "How dare you hit me like that?" shouted Nasreddin. The young man said he'd mistaken Nasreddin for a friend of his, and that he thought Nasreddin was making a lot of noise about nothing. This insult made Nasreddin even angrier, of course, and he at once arranged for the young man to be brought before a judge. There was nothing for the young man to do but to appear before the court. Now, the judge who heard the case was a friend of the young man's father, and although he pretended to be quite fair, he was thinking how he could avoid punishing the young man while at the same time not appearing unjust. Finally he said to Nasreddin, "I understand your feelings in this matter very well. Would you be satisfied if I let you hit the young man as he hit you?" Nasreddin said he would not be. The young man had insulted him, and should be properly punished. "Well then," said the judge to the young man, "I order you to pay 10 liras to Nasreddin." 10 liras was very little for such a crime, but the young man didn't have it with him, so the judge allowed him to go and get it. Nasreddin waited for him to return with the money. He waited an hour, he waited 2 hours, while the judge attended to other business. When it was nearly time for the court to close, Nasreddin chose a moment when the judge was especially busy, came up quietly behind him, and hit him hard on the back of the neck. Then he said to him, "I'm sorry, but I can't wait any longer. When the young man comes back, tell him that I've passed my right to the 10 liras on to you."
It was snowing heavily, and the wind was blowing the snow into great piles against the fences at the sides of the road. In some places the piles were so big that they were beginning to spread right across the road, but as long as cars could keep moving rather fast, they were still managing to get through. There was one point, however, where there was a sharp bend in the road. There the snow had piled up on both sides, and as cars had to slow down to get round the corner safely, their drivers had to be very skillful to avoid getting stuck. At last, of course, there was one who was not skillful enough, and who let his car stop on the corner. When he tried to start it again, the wheels slipped, and the car finished up deep in the snow and blocking the road. The next car to reach the corner was in trouble too. The driver had been trying to keep up a good speed to avoid getting stuck, and he didn't notice the car blocking the road in front of him until he was almost on top of it. He put his brakes on hard. The wheels of his car locked, and it slid sideways into deep snow. It was not the last to do this. Car after car came round the corner too fast to stop properly, and finished up in the deep snow at the side of the road. Before long, there were 5 cars stuck as the snow continued to fall. At last, a neighbour saw what had happened and telephoned the local garage, which sent a truck to pull the cars out of the snow. The neighbour watched as the garage men pulled them out one by one. When they reached the car which had started all the trouble by getting stuck across the road, the neighbour said to them, You aren't going to move that one, are you? That's the one that's brought you all this business today.
One day Nasruddin went to visit King Tamerlane, who took him to see his horses and donkeys, of which he was very proud. Nasruddin naturally wanted to please the king, so he praised each of the animals greatly. At last they came to a beautiful cream-coloured donkey, which Tamerlane had bought the week before. "What a wonderfully clever animal it looks!" cried Nasruddin. "I'm sure it could learn to read, Your Majesty." As soon as he'd said this, he regretted his words, but it was too late to take them back any more. Tamerlane looked at Nasruddin. "Well, well," he said after a few moments, "so you believe that you could teach my donkey to read, do you? Well, you have 1 month to do so." Nasruddin knew what the king would do to him if he didn't succeed in teaching the donkey to read. He took the animal's rope and led it to his own house, feeling very unhappy indeed. Exactly a month later, he went to see the king again with the donkey and a very big book. He put the book in front of the donkey, and the animal began to turn the pages eagerly with its tongue. When it reached the middle of the book, it stopped and began to bray loud and long. Tamerlane roared with laughter, and then said to Nasruddin, "How did you teach it to do this trick?" Nasruddin took a deep breath of relief, and then said, "Well, Your Majesty, I first put some hay between the first and the second pages, so that the donkey had to turn the first page with his tongue to get the hay. Then the next day I put the hay between the second and the third pages, so that he had to turn 2 pages to get the hay. On the third day he had to turn 3 pages, and so on. Today he brayed because he was angry and disappointed when he didn't find any hay in the book at all."
One day, some wise men, who were going about the country trying to find answers to some of the great questions of their time, came to Nasruddin's district and asked to see the wisest man in the place. Nasruddin was brought forward, and a big crowd gathered to listen. The first wise man began by asking, "Where is the exact centre of the world?" "It's under my right heel," answered Nasruddin. "How can you prove that?" asked the first wise man. "If you don't believe me," answered Nasruddin, "measure and see." The first wise man had nothing to answer to that, so the second wise man asked his question. "How many stars are there in the sky?" he said. "As many as there are hairs on my donkey," answered Nasruddin. "What proof have you got of that?" asked the second wise man. "If you don't believe me," answered Nasruddin, "count the hairs on my donkey, and you'll see." "That's foolish talk," said the other. "How can one count the hairs on a donkey?" "Well," answered Nasruddin, "how can one count the stars in the sky? If one is foolish talk, so is the other." The second wise man was silent. The third wise man was becoming annoyed with Nasruddin and his answers, so he said, "You seem to know a lot about your donkey, so can you tell me how many hairs there are in its tail?" "Yes," answered Nasruddin, "there are exactly as many hairs in its tail as there are in your beard." "How can you prove that?" said the other. "I can prove it very easily," answered Nasruddin. "You can pull 1 hair out of my donkey's tail for every one I pull out of your beard. If the hairs on my donkey's tail don't come to an end at exactly the same time as the hairs in your beard, I'll admit that I was wrong." Of course, the third wise man wasn't willing to do this, So the crowd declared Nasruddin the winner of the day's arguments.
It was a very wide river, with many great curves in it, and in one of these there lived a large number of wild pigs. Nobody could remember how they had got there, but they managed to live through floods, fires, ice, and attacks by hunters. Then one day a stranger came to the nearest village and asked where he could find the wild pigs. Somebody told him, and he went off. He had no weapons with him, and the village people wondered what he was going to do with the pigs. When he came back a few months later and said that he had caught all the pigs, the villagers were still more surprised. But some of the men agreed to go with him when he asked for help in bringing the pigs out. They wanted to see whether he was telling the truth. They soon discovered that he was. All the pigs were inside an enclosure which had a fence round it and a gate in one of its sides. "How did you do it?" they asked the stranger. "Well, it was quite easy, really," he answered. "I began by putting out some Indian corn. At first they would not touch it. But after a few weeks, some of the younger pigs began to run out of the bushes, take some of the corn quickly, and then run back. Soon all the pigs were eating the corn I put out. Then I began to build a fence round the corn. At first it was very low, but gradually I built it higher and higher without frightening the pigs away. When I saw that they were waiting for me to bring the corn each day, instead of going and searching for their own food, as they had done in the past, I built a gate in my fence, and shut it one day while they were all eating inside the enclosure. I can catch any animal in the world in the same way, if I can get it into the habit of depending on me for its food."
Although Nasruddin was a poor man, he decided one day to take King Tamerlane a roast goose as a present. Now Nasruddin hadn't had much to eat that day, and soon the smell of the roast goose as he carried it to the king became too much for him, so he tore off one of its legs and ate it. When he came before the king and offered him the goose, Tamerlane at once noticed that one of the legs was missing. Now he had himself been born with one bad leg, so that he had never been able to walk properly. When he saw that the goose that Nasruddin was offering him had only one leg, he therefore thought that Nasruddin had done this on purpose to remind him of his own leg. Of course he was very angry, and as he was a man who was not slow to punish those who angered him, Nasruddin was very frightened. "Where is the goose's other leg?" the king shouted. "Your Majesty," answered Nasruddin, trembling, "all the geese in this part of the country have one leg only." "So you think I am a fool, do you?" Tamerlane answered. "Certainly not, your Majesty," said Nasruddin. "If your Majesty will look out of the window, you will see geese with one leg by the side of your pond." Tamerlane looked out of the window, and there the geese were, resting on one leg beside the water. The king at once ordered one of his servants to chase the birds away. The servant took a big stick and threw it at them, and of course they put down their other legs and ran away. "There," said Tamerlane, "you were lying, Nasruddin. That shows that the geese in this part of the country have two legs like all other geese." "I beg your pardon, your Majesty," answered Nasruddin, "but it doesn't show anything of the kind. If your servant threw a big stick like that at me, I might grow 2 more legs myself to help me run away faster."
A certain hunter had found a piece of forest where there were plenty of animals to hunt. The only trouble was that the place was very difficult to get to. He returned from his first visit to the place in late autumn, and couldn't get back until the snows melted in the following spring. Then he went to the pilot of a small plane, who earned his living by carrying hunters over parts of the country where there were no roads and no railways, and asked him to take him back to his favourite piece of forest. The pilot didn't know the place, so the hunter showed it to him on the map. "But there's nowhere to land there, man," said the pilot. "I've flown over that part of the country on my way to other places, and I know that we can't land anywhere between this river and these mountains." "I thought you were a wonderful pilot," said the hunter. "Some of my friends said you could land a plane on a postage stamp." "That's right," answered the pilot. "I can land a plane where nobody else can. But I tell you, there's nowhere to land in the place you're talking about." "And what if I tell you that another pilot did land me there last spring?" said the hunter. "Is that true?" asked the pilot. "Yes, it is, I swear it." Well, this pilot couldn't let himself be beaten by another, so he agreed to take the hunter. When they reached the place, the hunter pointed out a small spot without trees in the middle of the forest, with a steep rise at one end. The pilot thought that there wasn't enough room to land there, but the hunter said that the other pilot had done so the year before, so down went the plane. When it came to the rise, it turned right over onto its back. As the hunter climbed out, he smiled happily and said, "Yes, that's exactly how the other pilot managed it last time."
George had stolen some money, but the police had caught him and he'd been put in prison. Now his trial was about to begin, and he felt sure that he would be found guilty and sent to prison for a long time. Then he discovered that an old friend of his was one of the members of the jury at his trial. Of course, he didn't tell anybody, but he managed to see his friend secretly one day. He said to him, "Jim, I know that the jury will find me guilty of having stolen the money. I can't hope to be found not guilty of taking it. That would be too much to expect. But I should be grateful to you for the rest of my life if you could persuade the other members of the jury to add a strong recommendation for mercy to their statement that they consider me guilty." "Well, George," answered Jim, "I shall certainly try to do what I can for you as an old friend, but of course I can't promise anything. The other 11 people on the jury look terribly strong-minded to me." George said that he would quite understand if Jim wasn't able to do anything for him, and thanked him warmly for agreeing to help. The trial went on, and at last the time came for the jury to decide whether George was guilty or not. It took them 5 hours, but in the end they found George guilty with a strong recommendation for mercy. Of course George was very pleased, but he didn't have a chance to see Jim for some time after the trial. At last, however, Jim visited him in prison, and George thanked him warmly and asked him how he'd managed to persuade the other members of the jury to recommend mercy. "Well, George," Jim answered, "as I thought, those 11 men were very difficult to persuade, but I managed it in the end by tiring them out. Do you know, those fools had all wanted to find you not guilty."